Good evening. I am Miles Taylor, and welcome to Defiance Daily. 2 words: domestic terrorism. These are the watchwords of the tragedy yesterday in Minnesota. They are the watchwords because before any video was released, before the public knew anything other than what the government said, the Secretary of Homeland Security and White House aides were saying what happened in Minnesota was an act of domestic terrorism. But then, as many of you know, first-person video emerged, not just from one person, from multiple witnesses on the scene. Video that deflated the lie. And yet, today, again, at the White House, the Vice President of the United States said this incident where an ICE officer shot and killed an American citizen was an act of domestic terrorism, accusing the woman who had been behind a vehicle, the wheel of a vehicle, trying to leave the scene, of being a domestic terrorist wrapped up in sinister left-wing networks. And then again this afternoon, the Secretary of Homeland Security, who said this was under investigation and that we needed to have caution because the issue was under investigation, went back in her same remarks to asserting that this was an act of domestic terrorism before the results of any investigation were in. Well, let me tell you this. I have responded to dozens of terrorist attacks in the past 20 years. I advised Donald Trump on counterterrorism. Hell, I co-wrote his national counterterrorism strategy, and I will tell you this. This was not an act of terrorism. A woman in a Honda with stuffed animals in her glove box was attempting to drive away from the scene and was hastily shot and killed by an ICE officer. And do you know why I know that? And why I know the Trump administration is lying to you? Because the video is available for anyone to see. We are going to talk about that today. We are going to look at a new analysis of that video, and we are going to discuss what the Trump administration is secretly planning by continuing to call this an incident of terrorism. Then we'll talk about how Congress, somewhat unexpectedly, is showing more and more signs of life, holding this administration accountable on Venezuela. And if you stick around, you can find out why. Finally, we will be joined today by author Jason Stanley, the best-selling author of the book, How Fascism Works, and one of the world's most sought-after scholars on authoritarianism. And I cannot think of a better day to be talking to him. This is Defiance Daily, dispatches for the Defiant. Thank you for joining us today. Like I said, we start with the murder of Renee Good in Minnesota. Now, the FBI reportedly is refusing to work jointly on a probe of this incident with Minnesota investigators, leaving them unable to access critical evidence. At a press conference earlier today, Governor Tim Walz spoke on the frustrations that he has with the blockades the Trump administration is already throwing up in the wake of this shooting. Take a look.
We've also spent a lot of time talking the last 24 hours about accountability. That means no function of government operates with impunity. It means when someone's in a position of authority and they commit any act that impacts our people, there has to be another place to turn to get justice. Checks and balances. Basic idea, the center of the formation of our country. It's the only measure that protects us from the abuse of government or federal overreach or tyrannical government. Yesterday, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the BCA, spent the day yesterday attempting to get that accountability. We have learned that the Trump administration has now denied the state that ability to participate in the investigation. And I just want to make this as clear as possible to everyone. Minnesota must be part of this investigation. These are nonpartisan career professionals that have spent years building the trust of the community. There's a BCA Force Investigations Unit that was created by the legislature, by the people of Minnesota, to provide an independent, consistent, and trusted mechanism for investigating the use of force incidents involving law enforcement officers.
Now, Waltz went on to explain the importance of including the MBCA, this is Minnesota's FBI, in the investigation, noting that they have managed to work on complex and sensitive investigations like this in the past, like the investigation into George Floyd. But alarm bells are sounding now because the administration is already trying to close the doors. The administration is already shutting down the possibility of transparency and integrity in this investigation by including state officials, which normally would be something that's quite routine. At a White House press conference later on, after Waltz spoke, a member of the press asked Vice President J.D. Vance about exactly this, about the unwillingness to work with state officials on the investigation. And here's what he had to say.
President, thanks for taking my question. So the head of Minnesota's investigations agency says that the U.S. Attorney's Office has essentially cut off the state investigations agency's access to the investigation. What is the precedent for that, and why shouldn't the Minnesota officials on the ground have access and evidence to work on this investigation?
First of all, I wish the state officials in Minnesota would investigate why you have so many people who are using their vehicles and other means to actually interfere with a legitimate law enforcement operation. The precedent here is very simple. You have a federal law enforcement official engaging in federal law enforcement action. That's a federal issue. That guy is protected by absolute immunity. He was doing his job. The idea that Tim Walz and a bunch of radicals in Minneapolis are going to go after and make this guy's life miserable because he was doing the job that he was asked to do is preposterous. I
want you to remember the words you heard there from the vice president, because I think you're going to be hearing them again in a lot of contexts. Absolute immunity. This administration is essentially willing to say, no matter what ICE officers do, they cannot be held accountable, and the administration will protect them. And I think to your average American, looking at what happened yesterday, it looks like this White House and this president have given ICE officers a license to kill. And now the vice president of the United States is essentially saying that that's the case. I want to pair this with one other thing, and we're going to talk to our guest about this today. News broke a few hours ago that in a wide-ranging interview with the New York Times, Donald Trump was asked about the limitations on his power. And this was a quote from him. He said he didn't think there were any limitations on his power, except one thing, quote, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me, unquote. That's Donald Trump's view on the limitations of his authority. Apparently, limitless authority that can extend downward to federal agents who engage in apparent acts of murder. Now, the White House continues to push this lie that the officer was acting in clear self-defense. But less than 24 hours later, the video evidence is insurmountable. The New York Times released a damning breakdown, a new breakdown of the events that shed truth on the sequence that led to the murder of Renee Good. This is a long clip, but I want you to watch it. I want you to pay attention because these details matter.
On Wednesday, in Minneapolis, a federal agent fatally shot a motorist, 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good. Trump administration officials said these were, quote, defensive shots, fired because the officer was being run over.
And a woman attacked them and those surrounding them and attempted to run them over.
But our analysis of bystander footage, filmed from different angles, appears to show the agent was not in the path of the victim's SUV when he fired 3 shots at close range. Here's how events unfolded. Moments before the shooting, the victim's maroon SUV is stopped in the middle of the street. Multiple unmarked federal vehicles are idling nearby. Secretary Noem alleged the motorist, quote, was blocking the officers in. Bystanders are blowing whistles and yelling at federal agents.
Go home to Texas!
Then, federal vehicles start moving toward the maroon SUV, with sirens and lights blaring. A federal agent films the scene on his phone. The driver rolls forward slightly, turning left, then stops and waves for others to go ahead. Two agents exit this silver pickup and walk toward the vehicle. Moments later, shots are fired. Let's look at the scene again more closely. This is the agent who shoots the driver. He walks around the car filming and disappears from view. Other agents pull up and order the driver to exit her vehicle. One of them grabs at the door handle and reaches inside. The SUV reverses, then turns right, apparently attempting to leave. At the same time, the agent filming crosses toward the left of the vehicle and grabs his gun. He opens fire on the motorist and continues shooting as she drives past. The moment the agent fires, he is standing here, to the left of the SUV, and the wheels are pointing to the right, away from the agent. This appears to conflict with allegations that the SUV was ramming or about to ram the officer. President Trump and others said the federal agent was hit by the SUV, often pointing to another video filmed from a different angle. And it's true that at this moment in this grainy low-resolution footage, it does look like the agent is being struck by the SUV. But when we synchronize it with the first clip, we can see the agent is not being run over. In fact, his feet are positioned away from the SUV. The SUV crashes into a white car parked down the road. A bystander runs toward the collision. The federal agents on scene do not appear to rush to provide emergency medical care. Eventually, the agent who shot the motorist approaches the vehicle. Seconds later, he turns back around and tells his colleagues to call 911.
Shame! You shot someone! You shot someone!
Agents block several bystanders who attempt to provide medical care, including one who identifies himself as a physician.
I go check a pulse!
No! Back up! Now!
I'm a physician!
I don't care!
At the same time, several agents, including the agent who opened fire, get in their vehicles and drive off, apparently altering the active crime scene.
A harrowing video from the New York Times, a powerful analysis. I will just note how in the video, the officer who was, quote, rushed to the hospital and who Donald Trump said was injured after nearly being run over, seemed to be walking just fine as he left the scene. That agent has now been identified as Jonathan Ross. I'm going to bring my colleague Xander Schultz here into the conversation. Xander, we are still getting, more details, even though the videos are out there, because the White House continues to double down on its story and creating additional controversy. And I think that that's taken what should have been a moment where there is pause and really caused the situation to spiral. I want to get your thoughts, and then we're going to bring our guest into the conversation. Oh, you're on mute. I don't know how that happened.
Right away, the streak continues. All right. When they first issued those statements, do you think the White House and do you think they were unaware that there was all this other footage out there, or are they just fully in the business of gaslighting? Did they think maybe there'd be some time till the body camera footage came out and things would cool down, or did they make those statements knowing that these videos were out there and we could so clearly see that their story isn't the case? It was a complete lie.
Look, this would just be speculation, Xander, but I mean, the way the officers were reacting in that moment, after you discharge a firearm in a law enforcement investigation, things get serious. And, you know that, especially as the firing officer. And I think in that haste, they quickly tried to cover their tracks, defend themselves, passed up this official narrative through the chain at the Department of Homeland Security that it was an attempted vehicle ramming attack, so that could be the prevailing narrative. Now, the officers were clearly aware that there were people filming, but I think that their hope was they could set that narrative before any of those things reached the public. And in part, that happened. The first story we got before the videos were released was the story from the Department of Homeland Security that this was a domestic terrorist attack. But I think that compounds the outrage here that the administration said that and continues to double down on that. But perhaps, Xander, we shouldn't be surprised that an administration like this is engaged in that sort of massive gaslighting because, as our guest, Jason Stanley, has noted, this is what authoritarians do. I'd like to welcome into the conversation best-selling author and scholar Jason Stanley. If you have not read his book, How Fascism Works, it's a runaway bestseller. It's a fantastic book. Yeah, it was published, I don't know, 8 years ago, Jason, and boy, has that thing held up well. You're the closest thing to Nostradamus I've seen in a little while. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you. I mean, I wish it wasn't what we were facing wasn't like a cartoon of how to take over a country, but it is, and so it's easy to write a guidebook to it. Similar things, you know, they explicitly take advice from Viktor Orban, but now, of course, with ICE, we're reaching into sort of historical moments, like the Sturmabteilung in the 1930s in Germany. I think this incident was inevitable, and there will be more, and then there will be points at which people have to make decisions. I think this regime, they want to provoke a fight, but at the same time, I think, you know, they want to maneuver public opinion. It's unclear. It's a very volatile moment. However, they've put you know, $75 billion into ICE until 2029. You know, it's like one of the most well-funded militaries in the world, and it's entirely directed inside the United States. So, you know, $50,000 signing bonuses, $60,000 loan forgiveness, you know, beholden to Trump. So what does that mean? They don't know. We don't know. You know, it's all, I don't think they have a good plan, but I think they want to crack down on protests. Obviously, there's going to be protests of ICE, and, you know, they seem to want to create those to create another moment, like a mass movement that they can smash, something like that. I doubt they have a clear picture in their mind, but they have created one of the world's best funded armies that is devoted to completely internally to its own country.
Well, Jason, I'll actually correct you there and just say it's double the number you gave. We're talking about $150 billion.
Oh, 150. For that's Homeland Security, right? That's DHS.
That's from within DHS. Yeah.
DHS. Okay.
And look, yeah. and I'll add this, Jason, which is, you know, and I want to get your thoughts here, because Donald Trump seems to think that he has total immunity beyond what the Supreme Court has described, even though that's quite a long leash that they've given him. And I want to point you back to a quote from last summer. Is Donald Trump was talking about this incident. There were protesters who had defaced ICE vehicles. And Donald Trump has always, when he sees the video of something like this, he loses his mind. And he sees the video and complains about how these are brand new cars that he's given ICE, and that these protesters are showing total disrespect for law and order. That's his quote. Then he went on to say that he was directing the Secretary of Homeland Security to, quote, give total authorization to use whatever means necessary against protesters, calling them thugs. This is the language of authoritarianism. How do you react to that? Does that to you echo with what you've seen throughout history?
I think we're beyond that. I think this is a game we don't need to play anymore. It's very obvious what's happening. So, you know, if you can't see it, that, you know, it's weird inside the United States. I find when I go there, you know, that there's a kind of normalization of the extreme, but from outside, it's very obvious. I mean, Trump said today he has complete authority, and that seems right from the outside. It seems like, you know, the United States is, you know, I think the game of saying, how is this like authoritarian? I think the United States is an authoritarian country. There's a giant police force that is lawless on the streets, that is there to enforce the autocrat's will. There is one party, obviously they're acting like the Democrats will never be in power again, the opposition party. And then there's just the only questions here. There's no question about whether this is authoritarianism. This is not, November 2024 or October 2018. That's not the question anymore. The question is, how efficient are they? And I think I see a lot of incompetence. So Kash Patel, incompetent. A lot of the Department of Justice stuff, incompetent. Other stuff, quite competent. So when you're facing authoritarianism, you have to just say, are they gonna do it? Are they gonna succeed? That's the only question.
Jason, I have a question on that front. I just finished your book for the second time this last month. You have a whole chapter on law and order, and you often point to Germany, rightfully so. We all do. But I wonder, in your research, have you found other societies that were able to pull out of the tailspin in time from moments like this? Are there lessons that we can learn from the folks who didn't quite become 1930s Germany, but were on their way, but maybe had moments like this? A lot of people are saying this is kind of our George Floyd moment of the anti-authoritarian pushback.
Right. Yeah.
What can we learn from societies that have successfully pushed back when they see law and order start to become this aggressive?
Yeah, exactly. So what we're seeing is the tactic I talk about in that chapter, Law and Order, where you say, okay, we have to crack down. There is what they're trying to do is get enough of a protest going so then they can completely crack down. Like the authoritarianism will have its gloves off. I don't think they themselves know what that means, but canceling the 2026 election, something like that. So how do you negotiate this? And Tim Walz spoke about this. He's like, you should protest, but they're waiting for this. They're trying to. He said this. He said they're goading you into doing something. So it's a trick. I do think that they think that they've sewed it up, that they've got the plan, they've got it locked down, but it's going to be a tricky chess game. There have to be mass protests. The mass protests have to be peaceful. They will take any moment of property damage to declare, because this is how it works. You say things are out of control. The crime is out of control. These protests are in fact riots. This comes from our own history in the 1960s. The protests are in fact riots. That led to a massive prison industrial complex in when the protests in Harlem and in Watts were taken to be riots, and Nixon used that to massively expand the prison system. So that's but this is like that on steroids. So I think it's going to be a complex five-dimensional chess game between mass protests and the crackdown, and we don't know how that will go.
Well, I mean, one thing that we know is, in the past hour or so, Governor Walz in Minnesota has declared that the Minnesota National Guard is on standby. And this is interesting because we've spent the year talking about the deployment of the National Guard around the country in circumstances that didn't justify, where there were small, peaceful protests. Donald Trump wanted to send the National Guard to inflame the situation. But you've got Governor Tim Walz here saying, look, the whole purpose of the Guard is to try to keep things from spiraling out of control, not to go confront protesters, not to inflame a situation, but to prevent things from taking a turn that the administration could use to justify a crackdown. And I think, one of the big takeaways here, Jason, for me, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot in the authoritarian regimes that you've studied, is that the political opposition needs to do everything possible to not give that narrative to this administration. Now, they may not be able to do it, right? There's always a 0.1% of the opposition that's going to throw the Molotov cocktail, and that's going to be seized upon to say the whole opposition is that way. You saw J.D. Vance do it from the podium at the White House. He said, these are terrorists. There's a terrorist movement in this country.
We all know how it works. We all know how it works. And what's funny is we're talking about it. We all know how it works. We all know that you just described reality. And the question is, what is our reaction to that reality going to be? The reaction to that reality must be to keep in mind that this is a propaganda campaign, that this is all a setup. It's a setup it's goading people into, first of all, it's goading immigrants. Immigrants' lives are like they're hiding, their families are being torn asunder, like little kids their father disappears forever. Think like immigrants are being scarred for the rest of their lives right now. So, and then they're almost being dared to protest it's a terrifying moment. Not a terrifying moment. It's like, it's horrendous to see these kind of extreme human rights abuses happening. And of course, there should be a protest movement against, these extreme human rights abuses. But of course, they want that protest movement. That's why I'm describing it as 5-dimensional chess, right? I think all three of us here know what's going on.
Yeah, there's no way to avoid, if they're dead set on instigating an issue with a protester amongst millions of decentralized protesters across the country, there's no way to avoid that. That will happen 100%. I think that's why I want to go back to this question, because I want to make sure I get your answer on this. As you've looked throughout time in history, had these different types of leadership regimes that are dead set on creating these moments. Who's in your Hall of Fame in terms of the societies that have responded correctly, played 5D chess correctly? What did they do right? This is going to happen. It's already happening. And as people feel like these ICE agents or ICE officers are going to be able to hurt us without immunity, it's more likely to happen as people are realizing their lives might be on the line. They need to protect themselves, their neighbors. So it will happen. What does the 5D chess that's worked in the past look like?
Well, you can look at Bangladesh recently, where the students, the crackdown on the universities is, of course, intentional, because students often lead protest movements. It was true in Vietnam. It was, the campus is an important political site. So we see Bangladesh, the students led a protest to every time you read about almost every time you read about protests, they start on campus, like Iran too, the students, So that's why we had such a crackdown on universities here. Unfortunately, sort of set up during the Biden administration against the encampments, that was, like a way into being like, okay, we can crack down on students. In Bangladesh, the students rose up against Sheikh Hasina. This was, in the past year. She was autocratic, really just completely taking control. I won't go into the details of why. The initial reason they rose up was because of some kind of affirmative action program for people who fought in the War of Independence. I won't get into that. But then it became a democracy protest. Sheikh Hasina tried to write it off as sort of rioting and, the standard thing. But the students refused to stand down. Remember, Bangladesh shut down its entire internet system. And, there was a few days where I would have like taxi drivers in New York being like, I can't get through to my family. And so, but the students won. That's crazy, right? Like the Sheikh Hasina shut down the entire internet system, but the hundreds, maybe thousands of students were shot dead in the streets. But eventually the soldiers were like, okay, we don't like Sheikh Hasina either.
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah.
shooting down the, so it's no surprise that in Tiananmen Square, China brings in people from a faraway province to clean the. So that's why National Guard from Texas being brought to, you want to get people from far away who don't have some kind of connection.
Well, one thing that strikes me, Jason, about what Xander said before, I don't disagree with him that if the administration wants to create these false flags, if they want to create the incentive to go in and do a crackdown on the opposition that has some veneer of credibility in the eyes, at least of, maybe independents who buy the narrative, that they're going to be able to do that. However, what I would say is, even if that is the case, there is enormous value to everyone, all organizations in the opposition, using the language of nonviolence. And I'll give a very tactical, specific reason why. Today, when you heard the vice president from the White House, he made clear that their investigations are going to leapfrog from individuals like the woman who was killed in her Honda to whoever organized the protest nearby, whoever funded the protest nearby, and implying that the people who organized it clearly were trying to incite violence. That's why it's important that protest organizations, pro-democracy organizations make very clear, look, these are meant to be nonviolent protests, and they do know your rights training. So that record is very clear. So when the administration tries to bring sham prosecutions in the courts, that it's obvious these are sham prosecutions because people have been urging nonviolence. And largely, that's what I see. Yeah, please.
You're absolutely right, of course. But we're facing MSM-7. So MSM-7, which is the Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. It's what is that? Right. It's what is called
the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. NSPM 7. NSPM 7. NSPM 7 reorganizes the whole federal government to target political organizations that promote that like make signs for protests, and puts them like in the category of Islamic terrorism, because that was the last national security presidential memorandum, which shifted the whole government to target Islamic terrorism. So we all know how intense that was for our fellow Americans who are Muslim. We all know what that did to them. And, all of us have friends who went through that intense suspicion just for being Muslim. And it was intense. It changed the country. It created like a wave of deep Islamophobia and cemented so the question is, my question, and this is why I talk about incompetence. So this reordering of the system, which, is very important for everyone to study. It basically makes all of us into like on the terror watch list. It says, anyone who promotes anything that might call the Trump administration fascist or criticizing them, and anti-Americanism, you're now a terrorist. You do critical race theory, you're not. It's such a broad tent of coverage, and it certainly and directly targets any political organization, and it does so in very vague terms. Any political organization that can be taken as promoting, giving justifications for these protests. So it's so broad. So J.D. Vance is speaking correctly. Like, that's actually the reorganization of the government to target protests, organized protests, any political opposition. We're all quote unquote Islamic terrorists now. But you remember that video with the two guys going to the police station and being like, "We're Antifa, arrest us." Yeah, I mean, it's not. I don't think it's working.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point about one of the keys being the refusal to repress. And a key strategy within that. And we have a slightly older following. We just had our first monthly member meeting, leading with older people, leading with children like MLK did. In the Russian Revolution, they led with older women. The Liberian civil rights or end of the civil war over there was led by women, Lema Gabawe famously. We see the frogs here popping up. We see students playing that role. It's absolutely massive. I worry about in the United States, a lot of the folks that we are being confronted by in these ICE officers are recent hires. And sometimes in that refusal to repress, you're relying on them to see you as your fellow countrymen or someone that they're allied with in some way, or as their mothers, in the case of the Russian Revolution, et cetera. This is challenging because of kind of a lot of people took this job for this. Which is a little bit unique historically. Can you just touch on if our goal is refusal of repression in some ways with these ICE agents, what's the way Americans should be pursuing that and to disrupt this idea that we are all terrorists?
Right. Great. I mean, you just went through some of the strategies, and that's the level of strategy that we have to be doing, right? They're strategizing like that too, about how to take over the country. And so we have those of us who want to keep the democracy and keep a two-party system or a multi-party system, we're going to have to strategize back. And you just went through some classic strategies. Make sure the protesters have a human face. That means, of course, I mean, I don't want to. I think the gender politics is really complicated. Like in Ukraine, all these young men are being killed, and people are like, "Oh, well, it's not women and children," but no, it's still horrible. But still, putting women and children and older people in to the front that are very clearly not, are hard to demonize. That those are strategies, right? And that's the level at which we have to think. In Bangladesh, everyone was like, wow, the students, those are our kids. That's the future. Whether we have that relationship, they're trying to vilify students. So, but that's the way we have to think, right? We have to think mass protests. What's the strategy? What are strategies for mass protests that swing public opinion? I think a lot of people joined ICE because there's a $50,000 signing bonus. I mean, I almost joined ICE because there's a
it's true. It's an incredible amount of money.
Jason, you would have been a great ICE officer. You would have been sort of like the Aristotle within ICE, or maybe the Socrates of ICE, sort of the gadfly within the agency that's needed. We're going to have to leave it there, friends, because we have to move on to our other story. Jason, I could not be more thrilled to have you here today. We would love to do this with you more regularly. I will urge folks to pick up the book, How Fascism Works. I'm hoping that we're going to see a sequel soon, How Fascism Ends, perhaps. But maybe Jason will break some news here with us today. I don't know.
My most recent book is called Erasing History, and it's about the attack on education. But we just saw it's about the attack on history, like what the White House posted on January 6th. The complete rewriting of history. So my last book from last year is about, which was published before Trump came in, but I saw what was going to happen, is about those kinds of erasures of history, their patterns, how they function to keep an autocrat in power.
Well, Jason, you're on the team here, man. We need to keep picking your brain. You did a lot of work and research. We need to find our way through this. So
well, I have enormous admiration for you too. Miles, keep up. Take care, you guys.
Appreciate you, my friends. Thank you, Jason. Well, I will say this, Xander, one good news story today, perhaps two good news stories today, is that we aren't seeing the total domination in this second year of Trump's second administration that he had hoped. In fact, these two stories today show that there are perhaps a little sliver of light here, that there's going to be resistance from within his own party. We saw that with the Epstein files. We've seen that to some extent on the illegal boat strikes. But breaking news, as we're all sitting here, 17 Republicans joined 213 Democrats in support in the House, the U.S. House, of a 3-year extension of the Affordable Care Act subsidies. The health insurance subsidies lapsed at the end of last year. That bill, which just passed 230 to 196, will now head to the Senate. This, look, is a big rebuke. It's a big rebuke of House Republican leadership. It's a big rebuke of Donald Trump. They wanted these subsidies to die. They wanted the issue gone. And enough Republicans decided to defect to make it possible. And I'll pair that, Xander, with this other news story, and then you and I should talk about it. It's on the War Powers resolution, because that happened today in the House on healthcare. And then over in the Senate today, Senate Republicans, it was a procedural vote, but a symbolic one, an important one, voted 52 to 47 to advance a bipartisan War Powers resolution to block Donald Trump from using military force in or against Venezuela without congressional approval. Make no mistake, the White House did not want this to happen. Now, that resolution will face a full Senate vote next week before advancing to the U.S. House. And I want to name the 5 Republicans who joined Democrats in defying Republican leadership, in defying the White House to make this possible. Rand Paul of Kentucky, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Todd Young of Indiana, and Josh Hawley of Missouri. Here's what Josh Hawley had to say about it. He said, with regard to Venezuela, my read of the Constitution is that if the president feels the need to put boots on the ground there in the future, Congress would need to vote on it. That's why I voted yes on this morning's Senate resolution. Now, Donald Trump, of course, spun out upon hearing this. Here's what he had to say on Truth Social, saying that the vote greatly hampers American self-defense and national security, impeding the president's authority as commander-in-chief. In any event, and despite their stupidity, the War Powers Act is unconstitutional, totally violating Article 2 of the Constitution, as all presidents and their departments of justice have determined before me. Now, I will just point out, Xander, anyone in America or anyone in the world could go Google the United States Constitution and see that in Article 1 of the Constitution, the body that has the power to make war and declare war is the United States Congress. So this is going to be a tough argument for the president to make. But look, those two stories, healthcare and Venezuela, Republicans are starting to push back, or some Republicans are starting to push back. I take that as a sign of hope.
Yeah, not really the constitutional scholar, Donald Trump. So I'm not surprised that he got that wrong, amongst many other things. I'm curious what Trump's hand was in the healthcare decision, because we just had that snippet of him a few days ago saying, if we lose the midterms, I'm going to be impeached. And healthcare, like inflation, is one of the few things where you can't gaslight healthcare costs, and just costs in general. It's where you can't gaslight people, and he knows his popularity is tied to affordability. Maybe he had no hand in it, but I know a lot of Republicans were arguing in a Machiavellian way to wait until after the midterms for these healthcare cuts and try to accumulate more power. You know, maybe he does. It continues his authoritarian trend after the midterms. It's a weird. I honestly feel torn about it, because in some ways, I'm worried people will not feel the pain from the decisions the Trump administration is making in time to cast their votes in the elections that matter, and maybe our last elections. And so I'm torn. Obviously, I want people to have healthcare, but I want people to have healthcare long term. I want Americans to have healthcare long term. And I wonder if this was a strategy greenlit by the White House so they can be in better shape when midterms come around. Because I agree with Trump. He will be impeached if they lose the midterms. So I'm torn on how I feel about that.
Well, look, it's a really powerful point that he should be worried about that happening in re-election, in the midterms. There are people running for Congress on the platform that they are going to impeach Donald Trump. We will talk to one of them next week, George Conway, who is running in New York, famously, a conservative lawyer whose wife, Kellyanne Conway, served as Donald Trump's senior advisor. He's now running for Congress on that platform that he will impeach Donald Trump. And we'll talk to George next Wednesday. I hope people will tune in for that one. But I do think, Xander, especially on Venezuela, these are signs of life. These are signs of life in Congress, that they won't just do everything that Donald Trump says. And they know that they have a shot clock in the White House. That's why news reports this past week say that Stephen Miller has been engaging in daily phone calls that happen even on the weekends, berating people because he feels the time pressure to do these things. And the more slowing down of this administration's agenda we see from Republicans in Congress, the likelier it is that our institutions will survive the onslaught. At least that's one guy's take.
Yeah, there's no chance what happened in the Senate today was something the White House orchestrated. It's not good news for them in their desire to move with autonomy. What's the, Miles, how does this signal to you in terms of, it seems like it's exclusive to Venezuela, but obviously within a day of the Venezuela invasion, they've been talking about invading 4 to 5 other countries. Is this particular vote, it sounds like it's only exclusive to Venezuela, but will it create precedent? Will it inevitably lead to the Senate and Congress taking a firmer stance on their powers and limiting the president as he looks at other countries? What's your take there?
Well, look, I think this shows you that right now in the Senate, there are the votes to at least initially check the president on foreign policy. Now, there's not a filibuster-proof majority. And remember, the Republicans have the majority in the Senate. There are ways that they could block some of these moves from going forward, but it does show that there is the ability of those dissenters to put some pressure on this administration. Now, I would think that, Xander, take something like Greenland. Greenland is more likely to get more Republican votes, as in support of preventing the administration from invading a NATO ally, because it's a NATO ally. You've got a lot of Republicans who have no love lost for Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, who are kind of hesitant to check the administration on Venezuela because they don't want to be seen or accused by this administration of protecting drug cartels, whether true or not. But I would think that if we saw the vote we saw today on keeping Donald Trump from taking any further action on Venezuela, we're likely to see an even stronger vote to check him on something like Greenland. Now, I doubt that Republicans will do that preemptively until there are more signs of what the administration is going to do on Greenland. But it certainly opens up that possibility, and I'm sure there are those discussions happening today. I'll also say, Xander, this is probably a good segue to our final segment of the show that we do every show, and that is who is joining the Defiance. Now, I almost would have said today, it's House and Senate Republicans. I've given them perhaps a little bit too much credit, but today it's someone different. And it's important that we highlight those people out there on the front lines who stand up in the face of all of this chaos, who stand up in the face of these abuses of power. Today makes that seem even more dire. In light of the murder of Renee Good, the government wants you to be afraid, and some of us may be. And rightfully so. But as we know from our guest today, Jason, fear is a tool of authoritarianism. It breeds from it. So today, as I'm sure many of you have seen, many gathered outside the Whipple Federal Building in Minnesota to protest against the violence of ICE. They are choosing not to be afraid. They are choosing to stand up. And some, well, they just told ICE exactly who they are. Take a look.
Bunch of bitches.
Right here.
You heard it from me.
White supremacists.
That's right.
Proud people.
I hope you can see through those thick-ass glasses that you fucked up. You stand there and sanction this bullshit, and they kill a woman. They're ruining businesses that have been here for generations. They're fucking up this community. You can go home safe, but no, you're here to terrorize this city. A bunch of bitches if I've ever seen a bunch. And I'm telling you to your face. And if you don't like it, fuck you.
Amen.
Look, I know that was some spicy language, but a woman was murdered. in that community by federal law enforcement agents. An agency, by the way, I used to be deeply supportive of. I'm very pro law enforcement, but not what we saw yesterday, not what this president is defending, not what this Department of Homeland Security is doing. This is not why we created the Department of Homeland Security. This is not why I served in it in 2 Republican administrations, not to kill American citizens because they're inconveniently in the way on a snowy street. That's not what it's there for. And I have to say, these protesters in Minnesota are doing us right. They are doing the rest of us across America who watched what happened yesterday with a pit in our stomachs a service by standing up in the place where this happened. Now, I will say, there are calls this weekend for protests around the United States. I would urge you to join them if you feel the same way. Some of these will be spontaneous protests. Some of these will be planned. Some of these will be started by you with a sign standing outside of your courthouse. I would urge you to only do 2 things. 1, speak loudly. Turn up the volume. Make sure your fellow Americans understand what this moment means. And 2, do it peacefully. Do it peacefully because it's your obligation to deprive the people who want an excuse to crack down on the political opposition of that opportunity. I want to bring Xander back into the conversation so we can take some questions from members of defiance.org. And I will just say my enormous pride to the club of courageous Americans that is defiance.org, because in light of all of these things, Xander, the people who are members have funded actions to push back against things like we saw yesterday in Minnesota. In fact, I'll just make a quick note, as I did before. If you listened to the beginning of the video clips from yesterday, you heard people blowing whistles. You heard people blowing whistles to alert the neighborhood that ICE was there to conduct raids. That's been happening in communities around the country that have been targeted by ICE as a way to warn people, to make sure people are safe, to protect families, to protect individuals. And our organization, our members at defiance.org, have provided tens of thousands of whistles to communities on the front lines all around the country. It may have sounded silly to some people who didn't live in communities targeted by law enforcement agents. Why do we need to send literal whistles to people? They're not going to use them. They are going to use them. And they might save a life by using them. So thank you to everyone who did that. And I will say, if folks want to know more, if they want to donate whistles to communities on the front lines, you can find out more at defiance.org. Xander, the first question we have here is from Urban Hermit, who asks in the chat on Substack, can't Congress defund ICE in this month's authorization bill? Look, I'll take a first swing at this one, but then feel free to jump in, Xander. Short answer to that question is yes. I mean, at any point, it actually wouldn't even require the annual appropriation cycle. At any point, Congress could stand up and defund ICE or attach conditions to ICE's funding. I just argued this morning in our piece on defiance.news that it's the imperative of Congress right now. I used to be on the House Appropriations Committee, the fearsome budget committee that held the purse strings for Congress. And this was our most potent tool for getting the executive branch to do what we want: withhold money and force them to comply with the law, force them to obey congressional intent. That's something that should happen. Now, Urban, I don't think there are the votes right now. Unfortunately, I think that this Congress showed it was willing to rubber stamp the largest expansion of a federal law enforcement agency in American history for this administration. But that doesn't mean it's forever. And I will tell you what, I will remind folks what the Constitution says. Appropriations bills, they don't originate in the Senate. They originate in the House. Why does that matter? Because Democrats stand a pretty decent likelihood of retaking the House this fall. Yet another reason why voting this November matters. Xander, if you want to jump in there, and we also have another question here in the chat from Star.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same people who voted last year approving this budget, knowing what they were approving. So I don't think we can be hopeful that ICE will, or that Congress will do anything about the ICE budget this year. I think we've got to be really focused on the midterms and changing who's in office by this time next year. And in terms of influencing Congress, I think the foreign policy piece that just came up, the conversation around Venezuela, we need to think about influencing Congress more as a scalpel than a hammer. Sometimes there are certain narratives that are working. We need to lean in. We need to try to find allies in these specific circumstances. But in terms of like writ large, are we all of a sudden going to have this Congress that has been so easily allied with Trump to all of a sudden confront him around some of his major policy decisions? I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, all the more reason to be focused on the electoral outcomes in the United States. And I'll say this jumps to another question that Star has. She asked in the chat, as the regime says ICE is immune to prosecution, is this true? If not, what are the routes to prosecute? Now, the vice president created a lot of confusion around this today. You heard J.D. Vance stand in front of the White House press corps and say that ICE agents and this agent from yesterday have absolute immunity to do what was done. Now, there is something called absolute immunity in a law enforcement context, but I will tell you, it is narrow, it is role-based, and it is very, very specific. It is not some general liability shield for cops and ICE agents to go and do what they want, to go and kill people while they're on the job. Absolute immunity is when officers have protection from civil liability for actions they take when they're on the job, that are legitimate actions on the job. That immunity doesn't protect them from criminal prosecution. That immunity protects them from civil liability. It means if an officer is handcuffing you and the handcuffs are too tight and it hurts, that you can't sue the officer personally for $1 million in damages. That doesn't prevent a prosecutor in the community from saying that the officer acted maliciously and violated your rights. That officer can still be prosecuted. Now, there's something that is called qualified immunity, which is sort of an extension of this doctrine. But basically, both of those together make it harder for individual citizens to go sue a law enforcement officer personally for damages. But that is not absolute, because if a law enforcement officer intentionally, deliberately engages in a violation of your constitutional rights, there are these things called Bivens claims. If you look up a Bivens claim, there's the possibility of suing them civilly for damages. Now, I will say the bar to that is very high, but none of that is what we are talking about here right now, at least not yet, because what we are talking about is a criminal investigation into this action. Someone was murdered. The first priority is not, can the family sue the officer individually for monetary damages? It's, were the laws broken? And that is what's going to be investigated. And that is something that an ICE officer, despite what the vice president seemed to suggest, is not immune from. They are not immune from prosecution for engaging in that type of conduct. And that's what the FBI is supposed to be investigating. And that's what the MBCA, Minnesota's version of the FBI, should be involved in investigating. Yet so far, this administration is shutting the door to them, is refusing to let state law enforcement observe and participate in that investigation, which to me personally raises a lot of questions about how committed the administration actually is to an impartial investigation. Xander?
I think you said it well. I was in the criminal justice reform movement in this country for a while. It is hard to prosecute police officers when they have progressive mayors, when you have a progressive police chief, when they want to have a police system that is functioning on behalf of the community, is not behaving recklessly. That's not what we have here at the top of this organization. And so as much as I'd like to, provide a hopeful note on the prosecution of this officer or future officers, leadership as we know, is not interested in trying to ensure the safety of the public when it comes to ICE. They have an agenda. Some of that agenda is inciting violence and fear, and striking fear in the community is a big part of that. So I think you said it really well, Miles.
Well, look, we have to wrap today, Xander, but I will say this: as heart-wrenching as the news this week was, I get toward the end of the week here and I feel cause for optimism. Not just because of this story that we saw, these two stories we saw of Republicans in Congress finally growing a backbone, but because last night, we had a meeting in defiance.org, a members-only meeting of our club. The folks who are paid members of Defiance, who every week are funding efforts to counter Donald Trump's abuses of power. And I saw a group of people who were motivated. I saw a group of people who were inspired. I saw a group of people who are lowering the threshold for others to get involved. That is how this works. I keep saying this. I will keep saying this. If we took a time machine back to a year ago, you all who are watching right now would not see much of a defiance in this country. You would not see much of a resistance. You take that time machine back, you see a country that's afraid of Donald Trump's return to power, afraid because he had been forecasting, broadcasting, promising retribution and revenge. And that's what he did at the outset. He did it to me. He did it to friends. He did it to family. He did it to former colleagues. He's done it to entire institutions in our society. Hell, he's doing it to our allies right now. And the people who were at that meeting last night were not deterred by that. They were not deterred by that. They joined defiance.org anyway. They've joined other protest organizations anyway. They've gone out on the streets despite those threats and continued to inspire their fellow Americans to stand up. So I tell you, last night, we met with that club and I came away encouraged. We are going into 2026, folks, with the momentum at our backs. And when I say we, I don't mean Democrats. I'm not even a registered Democrat. I mean Republicans, Democrats, independents, people of conscience who don't support the constitutional violations we are seeing and the abuses of power. We are a more defiant country now in early 2026 than we were a year ago. And this is the year we shift from defensive to defiant as a country. Very proud to be a part of this organization. Very proud to work with those of you out there who are our members. If you are not, check us out. Come join the Club for Courageous Americans. Thank you for watching today's program. Every day you can watch us at 5 p.m. Eastern across platforms. As always, stay loud, stay brave, and stay together. This has been Defiance Daily, dispatches for the defiant.